Hello, everybody, and welcome to Apocalypse Now, a Bible study. We're going to be talking about the end times. We're going to be talking about the books of Daniel and Revelation. We're going to be talking about what apocalypse means and why it matters to us. So, what I'm going to do for this first session is just kind of walk through some of the main questions and issues that are at stake as we'll make our way through what will ultimately be, including this week, an 8-week study. But at the end of this, I'm going to kind of go through our syllabus and talk through what the topics will be for each week and what the pattern will be, because we're doing it a little bit differently as we incorporate in some other media and literature aside from the Bible. So, firstly, let me just kick this off by asking y'all, during the time before we started our recording with our introductions, you kind of talked a little bit about this, some of you, but when you hear this word apocalypse, what comes to mind?
Explosions, bombs.
Explosions, bombs. Thanks, Paul. Yeah.
Marlon
Mostly
Brando movie.
Marlon Brando movie. Okay, yeah. I think
total
somebody else was
distraction.
destruction.
Total distraction.
Yeah.
Total
Yeah.
destruction. Yeah.
Change.
Change. Yeah. Thanks, John. Anything else folks want to name that comes to mind?
Fear.
Fear. Yeah. Thanks, Fran. Yeah, this is a term that has become part of popular culture in a whole variety of ways and has been for a very long time, in fact. And so I'm going to kind of walk through some of the reasons why we're doing this. So when we hear this word apocalypse, a whole variety of realities come to mind. Apocalypse has become, in some ways, for some people, kind of a joke, actually. Something that folks tend to make fun of. Are y'all seeing this little cartoon here? It's sort of a play on the idea that there are some people who've been awaiting the apocalypse, and in fact, we'll talk about this some. There have been some folks who've appointed a particular time and date, and so this is a joke about why it hasn't happened. And so here you see 3 out of the 4 horsemen that are described in the book of Revelation. And one of them is saying, we have to reschedule the apocalypse, pestilence phoned in sick again. So for some folks in popular culture, the apocalypse has become sort of a joke. And additionally, it's become kind of a way of creating cultural products and artifacts. And so here are just a few shows, only just a few of the many shows and movies that are out there that you could watch right now. One of them, Station 11, is about a pandemic that basically wipes out the bulk of humanity. The Last of Us is about a mushroom that does basically the same thing, but kind of turns humans into these zombie-like creatures. And then Carol and the End of the World is sort of a cartoon take on the apocalypse. So we kind of go from humor to some interesting, fantastical, sci-fi, fantasy attempts to talk about the apocalypse. But then there are people for whom this is serious business. People that have been talking about the apocalypse, have been talking about the end times in real ways, in real terms for a very long time. Billy Graham here, one of Christianity's most famous evangelists. Here he is on the left. In a lot of his sermons and even in a lot of the media that the organizations that he helped create continue to put out, they still talk about the end times and what Christians need to do to prepare, to make sure that they are ready for the end times. Adrian Rogers, who, as some of you may know, helped make Bellevue Baptist into the megachurch that it is and has put out a whole variety of media, you can find a variety of sermons online where he talks about Christians preparing for the end times, and in particular, signs. What are the signs that we are in the end times? And then this last person, his name is Harold Camping, and I'll talk a little bit more about him a bit later. But this is a person who actually defined a couple of dates at which he was certain the apocalypse would happen. So again, this idea of the apocalypse being synonymous with end times or with Armageddon or with the collapse of humanity and existence as we know it, this is an idea that's been in popular culture and people's imaginations for a very long time, even predating any of the media or people that I just mentioned. But what does it mean? What does the word apocalypse mean? Well, the word apocalypse comes from a Greek word, apokalypsis, which actually means revelation. So the book of Revelation is, its official title actually is the Apocalypse of John. So it's the revelation of John. And so apocalypse is actually an ancient biblical literary genre. There are lots of apocalypses. There is the book of Daniel, which includes an apocalypse, but that's not the only thing in the book of Daniel. There's also some history. The book of Daniel is where we get the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The book of Daniel is where we get other biblical stories that many of us maybe have learned about in Sunday school. But from the 7th chapter on through the 12th chapter, Daniel receives a series of visions that are apocalyptic in the sense that they reveal something. There's an apocalypse of Peter. There's an apocalypse of Adam. There are whole other apocalypses that fit into the genre that just didn't make it into the Bible. The only two that really did are Daniel and Revelation. We'll talk more later on about why and some of the controversy that surrounded even those books being included in the Bible. So, like any literary genre, there are certain traits, there are certain conventions that apocalypses tend to follow. Firstly, they are often oriented around a human or a supernatural being that reveals something. Either it's revealing something to the reader of the book, or there's a figure in that story, in the book, that reveals something to the main character, to the protagonist. This is a painting by Rembrandt that features Daniel having his vision of all of these different beasts. There are 4 beasts in Daniel's vision, and in that vision that Daniel has, an angel comes to him and interprets, reveals what those images mean. So we have a similar thing happen in the Gospel of John, where again, in the Apocalypse of John, John says that he has this vision and he reveals to the 7 churches in ancient Mesopotamia what those visions are. Any questions or comments about this part, this piece of what it means to be an apocalypse in this genre?
I was just thinking that the flood should probably, what do you do? Like go build an ark or something. I mean, it also brings up that thing of, wiping everything out and the morality of that from a God standpoint and so forth. I never thought of that before.
No, it's really true, Keith, and we'll talk some about that as we progress through this Bible study. The flood is an event in which something catastrophic happens. Why typically biblical scholars don't consider the flood an apocalypse is because it's an event, historical, non-historical, up for debate, rather than it being a vision of what's to come or what is already happening. So that's one of the ways that it's different. But we do get this sense of a world-ending event that takes place. So here's another aspect of this genre of apocalypse. There's fantastical visions featuring violent imagery, almost always. And so in the book of Daniel, there are these four beasts. And when we get to the book of Daniel, you'll see, if you don't already know, that these beasts are fairly gruesome and they are violent. Certainly in the Apocalypse of John and Revelations, we see beasts and we see war and we see torture taking place. This is a painting from a 16th century German manuscript, an illuminated manuscript, which was basically a way of illustrating the Bible in the 16th century, in this case. And you see one of the beasts from the book of Revelation eating people. And that's a reference to chapter 11 in the book of Revelation, where the vision that John describes mentions beasts coming and eating the non-believers and the unrighteous. So we've got this idea of a human or supernatural being revealing something, and then we have these visions.
Pastor, can I
Yes,
interrupt you here?
sure.
You were saying, would the angels coming to Mary, telling her that she's going to bear a child, be an apocalypse?
That's a great question, Fran. And so, and also in those chapters of Matthew and Luke, in those infancy stories, Joseph has these dreams, right? Where angels come to him and they talk to him. Often, why people don't consider those to be apocalyptic in that sense is that what's happening is, rather than Mary having a vision of something that needs to be interpreted, an
Okay.
angel comes and speaks to her. And so there's lots of moments in the Bible where either A, we have some sort of catastrophic event, the flood, the burning of Sodom and Gomorrah, or we have this vision that happens where an angel visits someone in a dream or God speaks to someone. But very often, what you have in these apocalypses is that there's a vision that confuses either the reader or the actual person having it, in the case of Daniel, and that vision has to be interpreted or revealed by some sort of supernatural creature or by the reader, him or herself. But it's great questions. Let's move on to two other conventions of this genre. And these are the last three. We got one more after this. So we've got this dualism. So there's a sense that there is a supreme good and a supreme evil. Or another way of describing it is that there's this supreme positive force in the universe, and then on the other side of things, there's this supreme chaotic negative force in the universe. And so both in Daniel and in Revelation, we see this being described. And there's a sense coupled with that of this triumphalism, which means that basically the supreme good will win. There's not even a question of that. In the vision, ultimately what happens is that in this battle or in this relationship between good and evil, the good ultimately will win. This is a painting of the Last Judgment, an event described in Revelation that happens after Armageddon, which is this war between good and evil.
The idea of, is it 144,000 will be taken to heaven? Is that pertinent today?
You know, that's a good question, Paul. And so that's another one of those pieces that as we kind of go through the Bible study, we'll see that there are certain aspects of particularly evangelical Christianity that have taken the book of Revelation, some of the letters of Paul, particularly First Thessalonians, a few passages in Corinthians, and a few passages in the Gospels, and they've created what is essentially a plan for how the end times will happen. And one of the aspects of that is that 144,000 people will be saved and set aside, and pretty much everyone else will die. And so it is related to this moment of the Last Judgment, absolutely. But again, we'll talk in more detail about how that number came to be,
Yeah.
what the rapture means, what tribulation means. Again, if you grew up in an evangelical or conservative Christian religious tradition, these are words that are probably echo around your brain when you hear these conversations taking place. So we'll definitely dive more into each of them in more detail for sure. So in addition to this dualism, this battle that happens, and the good ultimately winning, lastly, we have these images that often scholars believe, and even in the case of Daniel, the angel just explicitly says to Daniel that the images are pointing to realities that are contemporary to the author or the interpreter's or the protagonist's time period. So in the case of Daniel, he sees 4 beasts. And the angel tells Daniel that those 4 beasts are representations of 4 different empires that are contemporary or historical and are relevant to Daniel's time. In the book of Revelation, the consensus is for a lot of folks, certainly biblical scholars, but then even also some evangelical interpreters, that Babylon is a reference to Rome, that John, who wrote the book of Revelation, who was exiled by the Roman Empire to this island called Patmos. We'll get more into this when we study the book of Revelation in particular, that he basically had was trying to describe the end of the Roman Empire in particular. And so a lot of the images end up being metaphors that are describing political realities that were contemporary to him. So we've got, as we think about this genre, we've got, let me just turn this off here. We can look at each other. Oops. There we go. We've got a human or a supernatural being who is given some sort of a vision. And that vision is revelatory in some way. It reveals something. That vision includes often violent imagery. Often there's this dualistic reality, supreme evil, supreme good. Then often, almost in all cases, the supreme good ultimately wins. And then lastly, there's this reality that a lot of the images are pointing to realities, political issues, empires that were contemporary to that author. So in addition to all of those examples from the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, again, those are the apocalypses, the books of the Bible, these ancient manuscripts that we know about because they made their way into the Bible. But there were many others. From the Dead Sea Scrolls, these manuscripts that were discovered several decades ago, there were other apocalypses in those that made their way into, in particular, the Catholic Bible. So Second Esdras, for instance, is a book that doesn't get talked a whole lot about in Protestant circles or really even in Catholic circles, but were books that were added into the Bible and thought of as authentic canonical scriptures that describe a vision of the end of the world. or this movement of good's triumph over evil. So, before we move on, I'm going to pause here. What questions are arising for you, or what comments might you have?
It makes me think that this is an announcement of what hell's going to be like with all the gnashing and all that. But the Bible doesn't really talk about hell, do you think?
It's true, Paul. No, the Bible doesn't, and the Bible also doesn't talk a whole lot about Satan. The Bible
Right.
doesn't talk a whole lot about a number of things that have become sort of standard tradition for Christians. Much of the images, just like you're saying, Paul, that a lot of Christians have about hell are based on the descriptions we get in Revelation. Nowhere else really do we get a sense of what hell is. And, again, thinking about all the similarities between Judaism and Christianity and how Christianity grew out of Judaism, in Judaism, there isn't really a conception of hell at all.
Right. Yeah.
And so, yeah, most of the Christian traditions' images of hell come from the book of Revelation and a few other places in the gospel, but the gospels, but mainly it's from the book of Revelation.
So Tony,
Yeah.
so hell is really referred to as afterlife, but in Revelation, it's really all about on earth, right?
Right. There's a lake of fire, right, that the non-believers and the unrighteous get thrown into. And again, how is hell often described? As a lake of fire. And these are events, Diane, to your point, that are going to be taking place, or that in the book of Revelation anyway, that would be taking place on earth, not necessarily in some sort of afterlife. And as we get deeper into the book of Revelation in particular, it'll be interesting for us to look at how some of the images of the afterlife that we have are really rooted in descriptions that we get from the Apocalypse of John. So, this word apocalypse, it's become synonymous with end times. That when we talk about something being apocalyptic, we're talking about it being in some way oriented around complete and total destruction. In fact, though, for most ancient readers and for a lot of other scholarly readers of the Bible, an apocalypse is a genre, like sci-fi, like fantasy. You can maybe even, it would be interesting to make the argument that in some ways, sci-fi and fantasy as literary genres, maybe in some ways have their roots in these biblical apocalypses, right?
Yeah.
Where something fantastical and awesome happens that totally turns the universe upside down. So let's talk a little bit about what apocalypse doesn't mean. So apocalypse is not the same as Armageddon. Armageddon is a particular event that is talked about in the book of Revelation. So Armageddon and apocalypse often get kind of tied up as being the same thing. They are not. So when we get to the book of Revelation, we'll dive more deeply into Armageddon, what it is, how people have interpreted it, and what have you. Also, apocalypse is not the same as prophecy in the Bible. Prophecy is a highly specific literary form, actually, in the Bible. So prophecy, for instance, when you look at the book of Isaiah, there are moments when it's written in prose, right? Just chunks, paragraphs of language. And then there are moments where there's a lot of indentations, where it looks more like poetry. And that's because the content of that prophecy is a kind of poetry. And so it's recorded in that way because that's the way it was recorded in Hebrew. And so in the books of Isaiah, Amos, Micah, prophecy is a poetic kind of language that is meant to be corrective. It's meant to say it's God speaking through the prophet to the people of Israel saying, listen, y'all, you've messed up. You need to stop worshiping this deity. You need to be sure that you are practicing the Sabbath correctly. You need to be sure, you strayed off the beaten path and you need to come back to God. That's what prophecy is about. And often it says to the Israelites, if you don't correct, here's some bad stuff that's going to happen. Or here's why some of the bad stuff that is happening, because you need to correct. An apocalypse, on the other hand, in most cases, isn't about correction. It's describing something that's inevitable. It's saying this is going to be what's taking place in a distant future. Or it might be saying, here's a fantastical, visually rich way of describing what's already happening. Again, we'll talk more about how you might approach either of those two different ways of describing things. So then, a fundamental question comes up when we're thinking about apocalypse. Again, as this Greek word that means reveal, the question becomes, what's being revealed? And so we have two possibilities. One, what's being revealed is a truth about the present. Just as we were talking about how in Daniel, these beasts, the angel tells Daniel that they refer to these empires, these historic empires. Excuse me. Or perhaps what's being revealed is a truth about the future. Truth about the present or a truth about the future. And this is where so much of Christian theology and so much commentaries about these books, so much planning, so much media, so many books and sermons and organizations, this is where a lot of the focus gets placed, is that what's being revealed is a truth about the future. And so I mentioned to you that one of the three folks that I'd shown you pictures of, one of them was Harold Camping. So Harold Camping is a pastor and preacher who believed that the end of the world would happen on May 21st, 2011. And there were other folks in the 80s in particular who believed that the end of the world would happen in 1988. And then when that didn't happen, they revised. They said they went into a whole lot of biblical study and looking at parallels where God says a day to me is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is like a day. And so they go through all of these machinations and calculations and they say, well, actually, the end of the world is going to be on May 21st, 2011. Okay, that didn't happen. May 22nd, 2011. They said, well, actually, it's going to be in October of 2011. Okay. Well, then that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And
Oops.
then it's fascinating that ultimately Harold Camping says, I was wrong. I was wrong about this. And
I could be wrong, but doesn't the Bible say that nobody's going to know?
the
Yeah.
Bible does say that. Yeah. In the book, in the Gospel of Matthew, in chapter 24, Jesus says, no one will know. I don't even know. He in fact says that it hasn't even been revealed to me. The
Well, they
appointed
must not
time.
be reading the Bible, I guess.
Well, so here's the thing. What we'll do next week, and we'll start looking at the syllabus in just a minute together. What we'll do next week actually is gather at Sue Westmoreland's house, and we will watch a documentary called Apocalypse Later, Harold Camping versus the End of the World. And this documentary actually tells you the story of Harold Camping. It goes into some of the content that we've just talked about what apocalypse is and what it means. The documentarian interviews some biblical scholars, spent a lot of time with Harold Camping, and they talk to him and they go to his church actually in the week leading up to May 21st. And then they interview him after May 21st passes and October 2011 passes. And you get to see this person really reckon with
Wow.
this idea that he built his whole life around. And by the way, a bunch of other people he convinced to build their lives around, and what he does when he has to reckon with the fact that he was wrong. And so
Is there
this
some way that I
passage,
can watch it?
yeah, it's on Prime Video. Yes, you can
Okay,
rent it.
what's the name of it?
It's called Apocalypse Later. And what I'll do is I will email all of y'all. If you can just put your email in the chat, just so I make sure that I've got it. You put your email in the chat, I will email all of y'all this syllabus so that you've got it and you can kind of follow along. So for those of you who won't be able to join us at Sue's house on Wednesday, next Wednesday at 6 p.m., I will send you the syllabus, and they'll be included in that the name of the documentary and also a couple of questions that you can just kind of meditate on as you're watching it. Before I go over the syllabus in more detail, are there any other thoughts or questions, things that this little intro has brought up for you before we move on?
Well,
I was, oh,
I would just
Go
say
ahead,
that
Pamela.
just from what I've heard today, I'm getting these little glimpses of things that are in fact helpful to me in the way I think about whatever life, the universe, whatever it is we think about when we think about God. And I'm sort of like, yeah, we should have been talking about this the whole time. But of course, being from the South and being from Memphis, I know why we didn't. I can see why we just left that out of our whole church identity. But at the same time, I'm like, this might have some good stuff in it. So
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Pamela. I think because what you're talking about also is kind of an underlying issue here is a question of how we look at the Bible. Do we see the Bible as one consistent narrative that you can track from Genesis to Revelation, and that all of these different books are all pointing to the same kind of reality? That's what a lot of evangelical, more conservative Christians try to do. They try to say that in the book of Daniel in particular, there is a moment in which Daniel sees a vision of someone he describes as the Son of Man. What a lot of evangelical Christians have done is to say, well, obviously that's Jesus. And okay, we'll go into what the arguments are around that. But if you look at the Bible as a collection of different books with different interests and different focuses, written by different people for different reasons at different times, well, then suddenly you get a really different picture about how all of these verses either do or maybe don't relate to one another. Now, does that mean we throw everything out? That none of it matters? That God isn't real? That our faith doesn't have a foundation? No, not at all. If anything, I would make the argument that taking that other approach to looking at the Bible as a compilation of different people's attempts to make sense of life and relationship with God, I think in fact we get a richer sense of what life with God can look like.
Won't that be what people will think of us when we're all gone, 100 and 200 years ago from now? Whatever your writings are, or whatever we tempted to do, it's going to be a compilation. It might not be a Bible, but it would be a compilation of what we felt, who we were.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, Fran. Absolutely. I'm gonna share now our syllabus and we can talk through it together here with our last few minutes. So, can y'all see this white sheet?
Yep.
Okay, great. Again, I'm going to email this to everybody who's put their email in the chat. So if you haven't done that yet, go ahead and do that. So our first session, what we've done. What is an apocalypse? What's revelation really mean? Are we talking about a revelation of the present, of a truth that is about the present, whatever the author's present might have been? Or are we talking about truth about the future? And so let's talk a little bit about what the rest of our sessions will look like. So next Wednesday, August 14th at 6 p.m., we'll watch a movie, Apocalypse Later, Harold Camping versus the End of the World. If you're not able to be at Sue's house with us next Wednesday at 6, that's totally fine. You can watch it on your own. It's on Prime Video. You can rent it for $3.99 or you can buy it for $12 if you think you're really going to love it. And here are some questions that you can be thinking about. When was a time that you changed a long-held belief? At this point, after watching the movie, how has your view of apocalypse changed, and what are you still curious about? Then, Tuesday, August 20th, we'll be back on Zoom at 10 a.m., and we're going to look at the book of Daniel in more detail. We're going to talk about the history. How did this book make it into the Bible? And then we're going to look at different ways that people have interpreted Daniel's visions, in particular the vision in chapter 7, and how people have seen it as an approach to looking at the history of the Israelites and their journey into exile and through exile, and Israel's relationship with the rising and growing Greek Empire. We'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll also talk about how we see certain patterns getting set up for beasts, an angelic interpreter, how we see certain patterns getting set up that we'll see play out later on in Revelation. Then, that following Wednesday of the next week, Wednesday, August 28th, at 6 p.m., we'll gather at Sue's house once again. And this time, rather than watching a movie, we're going to read together an excerpt from Octavia Butler's book, Parable of the Sower. This was a book that was written in 1993 and is set, believe it or not, on July 28th, 2024. That's when the first passage, it's sort of a journal. And that's when the first entry is, July 28th, 2024. And so we'll look at Octavia Butler's vision for what the world would be, and we'll talk about that some together. Again, with the idea that this vision of the future might have something to tell us about at least what Octavia Butler believed was true about her present. Then, on Tuesday, September 3rd, we'll talk about the end of the world as told by John, 10 a.m. on Zoom together. And we'll talk about how this book made it into the Bible. And we'll particularly look at all the controversy that surrounded it, because there were many ancient Christians who did not believe the book of Revelation should be part of the New Testament. And we'll take a look at why they said that, and we'll take a look at why it ended up making it into the New Testament. And we'll talk about history. We'll talk about some of the contemporary politics that were going on. We'll talk about ways people have interpreted it as a vision of the future. And we'll also talk about how the Jesus depicted in the Gospels, ways that Jesus is really different from the Jesus depicted in the book of Revelation. And then on September 11th, 6 p.m. at Sue's house, we're going to watch the movie The Matrix. And if you've seen that movie, as I imagine many of you have, I still encourage you to re-watch it with this set of lenses on, because you'll start to see things, I suspect, that resonate with you, and thinking about Matrix as sort of an apocalypse. ways that it might resonate with you that could be instructive and helpful as we make our way through all of these kind of fantastical visions that we see in Daniel and the book of Revelation. And then lastly, for our last two sessions on Tuesday, September 17th, we'll look at apocalypticism, which is many sociologists have the word that many sociologists have used to describe what is essentially a social movement of people who are preparing themselves for the end of the world and have been for quite some time. And so we'll talk about in particular these ideas of rapture, tribulation, and some of the other themes that we see, the 144,000 people that are going to be saved, dispensationalism, premillennialism, all of these technical terms that Christians have created to try to describe what the end of the world will look like. And we'll also talk about how close are we actually to the end of the world? When we think about climate change, when we think about politics, when we think about the rise of AI, how close might we actually be to the end of the world? And then we'll talk also about what apocalyptic literature, why we would even read these books. If we don't take this to be sort of a game plan, God's game plan for the end of the world, what's the use in even reading these books? We'll talk about that as we near the end of our time together. And then lastly, on September 25th, we'll read a short story called History Report from Simon Rich's book, Glory Days. Excuse me. Simon Rich is a humorist. He has written for Saturday Night Live. He's written for a whole variety of different comedic shows. He's been published a lot in the New Yorker and a whole variety of ways. And this book, History Report, is a vision of the end of the world. And we'll talk about that. The setup is this person's great-great-grandson has been assigned the task of writing about what Earth was like when people still lived there. And so he's talking to his great-great-grandfather, whose name happens to be Simon, and he kind of walks through what life was like then. And so it'll be an invitation for us to think about, well, what's most important to us about life as we live it on Earth. And again, we'll kind of pick up some of these ideas of how visions of the end of the world might reflect something about who we are and what we think is most important. So there's a broad overview of what we'll be doing together over the next 8 weeks. Now, if you're not able to be at every single one of these sessions, that's absolutely fine. You can jump in as you're able to and jump out as you need to. And so with that, I'm going to pause here for our last 5 minutes and ask if people have any questions about anything we've gone over. Okay. If you need Sue's address, so your address is in the church directory, is that right? Okay.
It is, and I put it in the chat as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And so if you're watching a recording of this and you would like Sue's address, feel free to just contact me or contact Sue, and we'll be sure that we get it to you so that you have it. All right, y'all. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for your comments and your questions. This, as you know, is a big old topic, and it's an emotionally charged topic. And what we're going to be doing might be upending some of the teachings that many of us were given from a very young age about what Christianity is all about, what it's for, where it's going. And so as we make our way through, if questions arise for you, you can feel free to email me. You can talk at church, and we'll just continue to kind of walk this through as we go. So thank you all so much again. I look forward to having these conversations about all of this stuff with you over the next 8 weeks.
I don't know about anybody else, but this is a little bit heavy, Pastor Tony.
It is that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm like, okay, let me grasp this now. Let me grab on.
I know. It is heavy stuff. It's part of the reason why I tried to work in some other non-biblical stuff. Not that any of it, except for Simon Rich's short story, none of it's particularly cheerful, but what it'll enable us to do together is to try to look at the Bible and then also around it so that we can get kind of a fuller idea of what's really at stake for us as we read these texts.
Sue, is there anything we should bring to make it, to enable, to facilitate if all these people come? Should we bring pillows to sit on or chairs or what do you think?
Well, I have chairs and yoga seats if we have to use the floor. So, get there early if you want the most comfortable seats. And, we'll make it work.
Okay.
Thanks for asking that, Joy. And thank you so much, Sue, for
Yes.
sharing your home with us for this. It'll be nice to be in a comfortable place as we talk about heavy topics. And I'll just say, for now, and I think probably still this will be true for me by the end of the 8 weeks, I don't think the world is ending. For whatever that's worth, I do not think that we are near the end of the world, at least not by God's hand. We can talk about why I think that as we go along, and we can talk about why you may have a different opinion as we move along. But I just wanted to say that right up front. Again, for whatever it's worth, I don't think God's planning to throw the bulk of us into a lake of fire anytime soon, or ever for that matter. So on that cheerful note, I'm going to bring us to a close, and thank you again for being here.
Yay.
You.
Tony, I'm embarrassed to do this, but could you share the book that Renew the Roots is the order book that's